Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the UBS Center for Economics and Society, I would like to welcome you to today's lecture and a warm welcome to all of those who are joining us at home or wherever they may be on the internet. My name is Joachim Voth. I'm a professor of economics here at the University of Zurich, and I'm the scientific director of the UBS Center and Institute at the Department of Economics. It's the time of the European soccer competition. So imagine all of mankind's history since men separated from primates as a 100-meter soccer field. And for 99 yards off that soccer field, humans lived in small groups of hunter-gatherers. And it's only 10,000 years ago, or 1 yard from the finishing line, that we actually start to get sedentary agriculture, cities, and so forth. The height of Rome happens 21 centimeters before the touchdown line. The Industrial Revolution, about 2.5 centimeters, the size of a golf ball. For most of mankind's history, people were incredibly poor, living standards stagnated, and ever since, we've seen rapid, sustained increases in per capita living standards. This is a big question. It makes it possible for all of us to be here. And probably no one has thought more deeply about how this discontinuity came about, why it happened in a tiny part of the Eurasian landmass, and within that, first in a small rain-soaked island off the coast of Europe. So Joel's been dealing with these questions for decades. He's the Robert Strotz Professor of Arts and Sciences and a Professor of Economics and History at Northwestern University. He's arguably one of the most eminent economic historians of our time, and if there's a betting system somewhere, I would put my money on Joel being the next economic historian to win a Nobel Prize. I'm not going to go through any of the long list of books, except that if you really want to see how economic history can be made to sing, I would strongly recommend his Lever of Riches. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Joel. We will have, before we start, a chance to ask questions. So please go to menti.com. And then you have a dial-in code where you can actually send us your questions. And after Joel is done, we'll have a bit of a live Q&A. So the floor is yours, Joel.
Thank you very much. I strongly urge you to discount this remark about the Nobel Prize. Otherwise, everything said is more or less right, which is I have been thinking about the issue of modern prosperity, and that's what I want to talk about today, and maybe give you a little bit of a different angle than the one that is usually given. So this is part of a joint project with my sort of Irish friends, Cormac O'Grada and Morgan Kelly, and there's a book in the making which, maybe within a year or two will see lights. Meanwhile, anybody who's interested in the slides, just drop me an email or send an email to Stephanie here, because they are basically in the public realm. I'm going to run through some of them rather quickly because I have a lot of them. So let me get going. So there are 3 terms here that that have been sort of floating around that follow up on what Joachim said. One of them is basically what the great enrichment. Okay, so everybody's gotten richer. This is due to my friend and colleague Deirdre McCloskey, who basically points out that, in fact, it's mankind, or the human race, I should say, as a whole, that is living far better than ever before. And that's not just true for, say, Europeans or North Americans. It's true everywhere. Even so, there's huge differences between different areas. Even in the poorest areas in the world today, people still live better than they did a century or 2 ago by a whole bunch of metrics that you care to look at. The other term is the Great Divergence, which was popularized by a historian of China, Kenneth Pomeranz, basically pointing out that one of the symptoms of this enrichment was the huge gap that was created between Europe and, in his case, China. But what was true for China, of course, was true also for the other Asian empires, as well as essentially any other part in the world. The term that I would like to propose, and this is the subject of a different book that I'll talk about tomorrow at our scientific workshop, is the great reversal. And that's slightly different. And it points to the fact that if you go and look at the world, say, around 1000 AD, or maybe even 1250, and you compare the three Asian empires, you know, the Muslim empire in the Middle East, South Asia, you know, the Indian subcontinent, and China, all of them are way ahead of Europe in almost every dimension that you care to look at: urbanization, income per capita, technological, scientific sophistication, literacy, and so on and so forth. Over the next 500 years, that gets reversed. And in fact, by, say, 1750, 1800, Europe has not only evened out with these empires, but actually surpassed them. So we call it the great reversal because these roles are reversed. And so if you have to summarize what's behind that, in one word, I would propose the word useful knowledge. So useful knowledge is sort of an 18th century term that I have adopted, and it's roughly equivalent to what we would call today science and technology. It's a little bit more than that, and maybe a little bit less than that, and we could argue about it, but essentially that's what it is. But I would use the term useful knowledge simply sort of in respect for the people that I'm writing about, which is largely 18th century thinkers. And the reason that useful knowledge is so important, and this is a central proposition that I've been pushing for many years, is because all other forms are subject to what I would like to call, and this is very economese, okay, but I call this the curse of concavity, which is a fancy way of saying that other forms of economic growth, particularly the sort of gains from trade that Adam Smith was so keen on, you know, or institutional changes that Douglas North pushed for many years, these things work very well and they bring about economic growth, but at some points, basically they peter out, right? They start running in diminishing returns. You can get some growth by, you know, starting to trade between two areas that hadn't been traded before, and the more they trade, the more growth you get, but for each unit of trade, the amount of growth you get is essentially declining. And at the end, basically, you reach some kind of theoretical point in which all the gains from trade have been exhausted, in which case you're doing well, you're rich, but there's no more great growth going on from that point. Useful knowledge, as far as anybody knows, does not seem to run into diminishing returns. We keep adding to it. And there seems to be no particular evidence that I know of, or at least convincing evidence, I should say, that says, oh yeah, well, this is going to run out. So my learned colleague, Robert Gordon, has written a book in which he basically follows this sort of old adage saying, oh, you know, most of the good things that can be invented have been invented already. So he and I have been debating about this for a long time, and it's been a fun debate, but the bottom line is, he's wrong. All right. Now, here's an interesting point. By the middle of the 18th century, on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, this knowledge gap was already there. And here is a quote I'm very fond of. This is from a book written by the famous Dr. Johnson, Samuel Johnson, very well-known British author and intellectual, who wrote a little book, kind of a take on Voltaire, really, in which there's this sort of make-believe Abyssinian Prince Raslas, who asked his friend, he has a friend who's a philosopher, and they have this kind of silly conversation. And this goes like this: by what means, says the prince, are the Europeans so powerful? Or why, since they can so easily visit Asia and Africa for trade or conquest, cannot the Asiatics and Africans invade their coast, plant colonies in their ports? After all, the same winds that carry them back would bring us thither, right? And that's actually a rather important question. You know? Imperialism is Europeans going out in the rest of the world and taking them over. The reverse does not happen. The answer, says the philosopher, that was provided was, they are more powerful than we, sir, because they are wiser. Knowledge will always predominate over ignorance. But why their knowledge is more than ours, I know not. So basically, that's the question that was raised in 1759, just on the eve of the Industrial Revolution, and I'm going to try to answer it. So we'll see how well I do. Now, as I said, this is a fairly recent phenomenon. Compared to the great Asian civilizations, Europe is way behind in almost every dimension. So the question is, what drives this great reversal? And so what I propose, this is a term I proposed a while ago in 2002, and I chose the term industrial enlightenment, which is of a combination of the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment. So it is, I must admit, it's a bit of a misnomer, much like the Industrial Revolution is a bit of a misnomer because it was more than industrial. And, you know, as far as revolutions go, it wasn't much of a revolution. I mean, there's no Bastille Day in which people, you know, burn buildings or anything like that. So, you know, but, you know, the term is stuck and we were so happy with it. And so what exactly then is this Industrial Enlightenment that we talked about? And so I want to, before I go on, I just want to point out that the Enlightenment really is a pivotal historical event as I see it. Maybe the most important cultural change in Western history since the rise of Christianity, and maybe even bigger than the rise of Christianity. Also, that's not a debate I'm going to have today. And here are two quotations of very different authors making this point. So this is from Michel Foucault. I never thought I'd end up citing Michel Foucault in an audience, but here I am. So what is Foucault said, you know, what then is this event that's called Aufklärung, and that has determined, at least in part, what we are, what we think, and what we do today. And here on the other side of the intellectual barrier, okay, Anthony Pagan, the British historian, no topic of historical debate has exercised anything like the hold which the Enlightenment does over the ideological divisions of the modern world. Now, the other pivotal event of the 18th century, of course, is the Industrial Revolution, which by most accounts, you know, is this game-changing point that Joachim talked about, which is all of a sudden living standards are starting to rise for a very large number of people above subsistence. And so, as I said, by 1750, in some dimensions, Europe is already ahead of the East, but probably not much in terms of living standards. After 1750, we can start seeing this rise in living standards happening. Now, so we have the 18th century. We have two things happening, the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution. So it seemed to me that it would be a coincidence if these two events, this momentous, were unrelated. Although, you know, establishing causality or what's causing what is a separate story. I'm not going to get into that. But basically, they ought to be related and associated with one another in some way. And so, is this Industrial Enlightenment a useful concept? So one way of maybe getting started is to say that the Enlightenment is a very complex and in many ways contradictory phenomenon. It's a huge tent, so to speak, and in it are all kinds of ways of thinking, and you know, people disagreed quite violent about almost anything. But for that reason, people basically slice it into sort of sub-enlightenments. You know, so you can do this geographically, talk about the Scottish Enlightenment and the Neapolitan Enlightenment, don't ask. But I find it more useful to slice it this way. So here are sort of three people who followed my idea of an industrial enlightenment. There's a medical enlightenment, an agricultural enlightenment, and an artisanal enlightenment. So obviously, this sort of notion of thinking about enlightenment by some sort of sector of the economy is not completely crazy. So we have all these different movements. And what kind of common denominator would they have? And so one of the things that I am suggesting here, and people may disagree, and people do disagree, but for me, the essence of what we should be looking at is a belief in progress. That is to say that the world can be made a better place in some definable dimension. So, of course, you might ask, well, what kind of progress, and progress for whom? And these are valid questions. And for an economist, the answer is obvious, which is economic growth, or if you want, an increase in material, measurable welfare. That's very intuitively attractive. But of course, it raises many other well-known problems about distribution and inequality and capitalism and, you know, blah, 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 blah. But there is still a sense that the key to progress is this concept of useful knowledge. And so let me take a 2-minute digression and point out that this is actually a radical idea. The idea of progress is essentially a Western idea that emerges maybe a century or so before the Industrial Revolution, at the very early stages of the enlightenment. The most standard quotation about the lack of progress is, of course, in the book of Ecclesiastes, where it says, there's nothing new under the sun, generation cometh and generation goeth. But if you go over the writings of ancient Greeks and Romans, there are very, very few cases in which the concept of progress actually pops up. There's one paragraph in Seneca that may suggest that he thought about it, but then later on it turns out he doesn't really fully mean it. I mean, there's a literature on this, but basically throughout the classical civilization in the Middle Ages, concepts of progress are very rare to find in the West. I mean, history is supposed to move in cycles, things go up, things go down, but it is essentially a stationary process. And what's behind that, I think, more than anything else, is a notion that the people who lived before us were smarter than we are. And if you want to understand something, you have to pick up some old dusty books and just look it up. And so each of these civilizations have their sort of set of sacred books. I mean, we know, of course, in the West, sacred books, of course, are the Bible, but subsequently, of course, in terms of for science and knowledge, there's a canon that was written by people in the classical age, above all Aristotle, but a whole bunch of other, Ptolemy and Galenus and so on and so forth. And basically, if you want to know something, that's what you studied, okay? But just as the Western Europeans had this, China had Confucius, and of course his Zhu Qi, his great interpreter. Islam has the Quran and the Hadith, and later, of course, Al-Ghazali, if you want to go that far. And of course, the Jews have the Talmud and the Mishnah and so on. And so, in some sense, the veneration of past sages is built into human society, and it gives sort of a conservative bend to the way people think. And so, I must say, this is particularly remarkable by my own forefathers. Jewish culture was very much afflicted by it. It goes back 3,000 years. And, you can look anywhere you want. There really is no notion of progress, except, of course, at the end of days, the Messiah will come, so you get a big discontinuous increase in living standards. But, of course, we're still waiting for that to happen. But fundamental to Jewish thought is a concept of what we call Yeridat Hadorot, which translates as the decline of generations, which basically says that the people who came before us were smarter than we are. And here's a quote from the Talmud. If those who were before us, Rishonim, the people, the first ones, were like angels, we are but man. And if those who were before us were like man, we are like asses. So this is this inferiority complex that people have vis-a-vis earlier generations. And that's diametrically opposed to the concept of progress. And what happens after, I'd say, maybe 1450, 1500, is doubts start creeping in as to how smart these earlier people were. And you see more and more books appearing that start criticizing the ancient knowledge, there's clearly Copernicus is one of the earliest ones who sort of undermines the worldview of that was inherited from Ptolemy and these sort of classical writers. But there is a French philosopher, Pierre de la Ramée, or Petrus Ramus as he was known, who actually was promoted on a dissertation called On the Errors of Aristotle. That's in the middle of the 16th century. So you can sort of see that this respect and this fear that they have for ancient writing sort of slowly starts disappearing. And I think the fundamental idea, of course, is that knowledge was cumulative. And because knowledge is cumulative, people pointed out, we knew what Aristotle knew, but he did not know what we know, so we know more. It's that simple. And that's a concept of progress that is really centrally important. And so, you think about this, because it's not totally clear that knowledge is not lost. Some knowledge of antiquity was lost, and we know other cases in which knowledge is lost. But once the printing press is there, it's very hard to get rid of knowledge. And today, I don't know of any sort of knowledge that has emerged in the last 300 or 350 years that's really been lost. I mean, you can think about one or two examples perhaps, but it's sort of hard. Because once you start printing books, there's always some copy extant where you can look up at what people did. In addition, of course, we had the great voyages, which basically showed that the world that the classical geographers and physicists described wasn't true. We have the new system of the solar system and so on and so forth. So essentially, you can sort of see this veneration of earlier generations disappearing. And I think this is, the essence of what we need to look at if we are understanding this revolution. And knowledge is the key to progress. And when Kant was asked, what is the Enlightenment, his famous answer was, sapere aude, dare to know. So you look at it and say, well, that sounds really good, but knowledge of what? And my answer is, from an economic point of view, it's the knowledge that can increase productivity, that can enhance technological change. That is what the Industrial Enlightenment was all about. And so you start to pick three writers writing in the middle of the 18th century who are totally clear that there is all that progress in the past. So I'm not going to read this to you because it's a bit too long. But these are three, as it turns out, more or less by accident, three very eminent writers of the Enlightenment: David Hume, Joseph Priestley, and of course Adam Smith himself. But you can find very similar writings in French writers like Condorcet, Turgot, Quesnay. All these people have this concept of progress. And everybody says, yes, we're living in a world in which there has been a great deal of progress, but there can be a lot more. And so what happens, as I said, is this sort of struggle between the people who were backward-looking and the people who are forward-looking, the people, so what's known as the ancien and the moderne. This is the sort of famous querelle that the French talk about. And essentially, the sense of inferiority has disappeared. Having somebody like Newton basically writing down the laws of motion of this heavens is, of course, very helpful. But it was far more than just that. And basically, by 1700, the Western world, they still respect the classics. They still teach Latin and Greek in high schools, and they still read, philosophers and mathematicians. But as far as science is concerned, basically, ancient science has been replaced by modern science. And this only gets worse over time. So here is, this is an engram, and you can sort of see this. The important line to look at, this is books in English only, but the French books look slightly different, but very much similar. But the important line is the green line. It is the number of mentions of the word progress and improvement and betterment in books published all the way from 1600 till about the middle of the 19th century. And you can sort of see it's sort of interesting. There's a rise of it a little bit before the Glorious Revolution, and then there's a fair period in which nothing happened. But by the time that the Industrial Revolution sort of starts on the horizon in the 1730s, 1740s, this is going up. And very similar phenomena are, if you look at things like knowledge and science, or you look at sort of economic progress, they all show something of this notion. So it's not neat, it's not, I wish it was sort of nicely monotonic rising, but it's not. And maybe that's history for you. The picture is always more complicated than you think it is. So then, what about the Industrial Revolution that emerges, and how is it connected? And so, it used to be believed that, Britain had the Industrial Revolution, and France had the Enlightenment, and that these were completely separate. Well, that's completely, dismissed now. There wasn't British Enlightenment. Certainly there was a Scottish Enlightenment. There was also an English Enlightenment. And of course, France did contribute a great deal to the Industrial Revolution. Even so, they couldn't quite compete with England. But both of them, I think, share this belief in progress. Even so, the kind of progress they were thinking of was quite different. And this is important. When you look at what continental philosophers are writing about in the 18th century, they're interested in the improvement of society, morals and morality. They're deeply concerned about the relationship between the state and its citizens, social contract and all that. They are interested about freedom of conscience and expression, and a little bit about the distribution of resources, about education, things in which society can be improved. And what the British Enlightenment is concerned about are much more pragmatic questions, How do we pump water out of mines? How do we determine longitude at sea? It's an enlightenment of, I'd say, of nuts and bolts, so to speak, okay? Pulleys and belts. Things that ought to work, things that ought to solve concrete, practical problems in daily life. That's what the British Enlightenment thinkers are concerned about much more than the French ones, which is kind of interesting. So that takes us back to the Industrial Enlightenment and to the main point here, and that is, in order for the Industrial Enlightenment to bring about the Industrial Revolution, there were two critical actions that were needed. One is, of course, the increase in the set of useful knowledge, that is to say, the generation of new inventions and insights, big and small, but basically the process of innovation. And secondly, the diffusion of things that we already know to people who can use them, which is a different set of phenomena. So I'm going to talk a little bit about both and be very brief. Okay, so let me first, so as I said, incentives and access are the critical story here. And now I'm going to talk about both. There is also a question of demand coming from the beliefs of entrepreneurs and industrialists, which is quite important, and I would like to talk about that, but it would run out of time. So it's another story, and I can send you to the literature if you're interested. But let me first talk about incentives, because that's really critical here. The problem, as every economist knows, of knowledge creation is, of course, that knowledge has very strong public good properties, right? It's non-rivalrous in the sense that if I have some knowledge and I give some to you, I don't have any less, right? That's sort of obvious. And in that sense, knowledge is a sort of classic non-rivalrous good. It's also hard to exclude people. So, if I have a restaurant, I can tell you not to come in. But with knowledge, if I give it to somebody, I lose control over it, that somebody can then pass it on, and I lose the capability of excluding other people. And finally, there are substantial externalities in the sense that creating knowledge is going to affect all kinds of other things that are unrelated. And so the people writing in the Industrial Enlightenment recognized that. And they suggested a whole set of measures and policies to overcome this sort of built-in underproduction of useful knowledge, right? So as we've known since the writing of Ken Arrow and before, is that because it's under-incentivized, societies will underproduce useful knowledge because nobody can make any money of it, so why should people actually spend resources and time and effort in generating something that they're not going to make any money of? So what kind of incentives emerge in this period to stimulate and bring about the inventions that we need? That's the question. So I'm going to make a big distinction here between two kinds of innovations. There are technical innovations, that's inventions, to say, so things, like the steam engines and, the power loom and so on. And then there are scientific advances, which is basically more like the nature of discoveries. And even today, of course, these are thought to be quite different. So let me first talk about science and then get back to technology and so on. So how are intellectual and scientific innovators incentivized? And here, I think much of the literature has pointed out, I think correctly, that of central importance here is what we call patronage. That is to say, if you were a famous scientist and you discovered something really important, you had a high probability of getting some kind of cushy patronage job. So you can end up being like a court philosopher, as Galileo was in Florence, and you can become, a counselor to the king, like Leibniz, or you become master of the mint, like Newton. So the real big stars of the scientific revolution got these nice cushy jobs. So these are famous cases, but in fact you can go and dig deeper and you just start discovering that many of these famous scientists got these cushy jobs as tutors to the children of noblemen, as court physicians, many of them were trained in medicine, members of the academies, counselors, and on and on and on, okay? So what this patronage job did is, these are the three things that intellectuals want, right? They want economic security and a comfortable existence. They don't care about being particularly rich, but they want, they want not to have to worry where their next dinner is going to come from. Secondly, the opportunity to peacefully do research and write. And third, at that age, maybe more than now, social status. Okay, so hanging out with the mighty and rich. So as I said, some of these became celebrities. Quite a few got patronage jobs without being particularly world famous. In addition, of course, all kinds of other non-pecuniary distinctions were given to these people. So The very first ones actually occur fairly earlier. We have these named chairs, okay? So the named chairs were carried out by Lady Margaret, who was the mother of King Henry VII. And then, we have various organizations, the medals given to people particularly distinguished themselves. So the Copley Medal, established in 1736, the Rumford Medal, membership, of course, in the Royal Society, and so on and so forth. And beyond that, there's simply a reputation effect. People, academics, intellectuals, have egos. I mean, this is shocking news to all of you, I know, but that's really the case. They wanted to achieve peer recognition. Interestingly enough, the person who wrote the best about this is Adam Smith. Not in The Wealth of Nations, but in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, which he points this out. What is it that people really want? They want to be recognized by their peers. And if you've hung out in the academic world, we haven't quite gotten rid of that, to put it mildly, okay? There are other non-pecuniary motives. One of them is religion. So this is the so-called Merton thesis. This is a very famous book by Robert K. Merton, one of the great sociologists of the 20th century. This was actually his doctoral dissertation, in which he draw a connection between religion and science, in particular Puritans in England, whom he considered to be a major force in the scientific revolution. Basically, the idea being that that God is so inscrutable and impossible to understand that we should stop worrying about what God is all about and instead study what God has created. And what he has created is the physical universe around us. And basically, we should study that and understand it, and that may help you understand God better. So Robert Boyle, sort of the great, as in Boyle's law, the great physicist, but Newton himself, even though he wasn't strictly speaking a Puritan, basically was deeply religious and really did much of his work, as he said himself, to get closer to understanding God. I'm not sure if it worked or not, he doesn't say. Now, that's as far as science is concerned. What about invention, which is really the core of the Industrial Revolution? Needless to say, invention, by and large, is incentivized more by financial incentives than by honors. Also, the two do overlap. And then a very important component of that are what we call IPRs, intellectual property rights, first and foremost, of course, patents, and to a lesser extent, copyright and things like that. Now, the idea of IPRs is very European. We don't see it anywhere, not in the Islamic world, not in Southern Asia, and certainly not in China, until much later when they actually copy it from the Europeans. Now, patents and copyrights start appearing quite a lot before the Industrial Enlightenment, but it really comes to full prominence only in the 18th and early 19th century, being recognized as a key to progress. Hang on one second. I think I skipped a... Oh, sorry. I have to use this. All right. And so what you see happening in the 18th century, both in England and elsewhere, is the... just a second. Sorry about that. Yeah. Is the notion that knowledge can be viewed as property, and that the owners of knowledge, that is to say the inventors, owned the rights, even so they had to divulge the details of the invention. They have to tell the world what it's all about, but they get some kind of right to exclude others. And that right, as we all know, in a patent is essentially a temporary monopoly, usually somewhere between 14 and 20 years, in which nobody else can use your new knowledge, even so people can be, can learn it. And so over time in the 18th century, what happens is the idea of a patent, the British patent system is established in 1624, but it's basically a form of rent-seeking in which somebody gets a monopoly from the king under some kind of excuse. The idea that this can be an incentive to innovation and therefore further social and material progress, that ripens over the 18th century. And it's fully described, once again, by Adam Smith, this time in his lectures on jurisprudence, where he makes this a very powerful case for patents. But in fact, French and German writers make very much the same case. So, you know, if Goethe has a famous paragraph about patents, which he bewails that the Germans don't have yet, and of course, eventually they're going to get it. And so the idea, however, of a patent is not just that it will be supporting and stimulating the economy. The importance of a patent is that the reward for an invention should be proportional to its contribution to society, which means a market test. And so if you have a patent and everybody really wants the product of what you are producing, you will get rich. And if you may have a patent that nobody wants, you will not get any money. And that's sort of, for Adam Smith, of course, that's very attractive because it's the market in operation. And in fact, it's very much part of the sort of liberal thinking in which, you know, new ideas have to meet some kind of market test. And so what you can think of these patents in some ways is an exchange transaction. This was pointed out by Mario Biagioli, who's a historian of this. And basically the idea is, we will give you a temporary protection as a patent, and you will disclose what's in the patent so that once it expires, everybody can do it. And that's actually turns out to be important. I'll come back to that. Okay? So here's one question. To what extent was the patent system really critical to the Industrial Revolution? So this is a complicated debate on which people have disagreed quite a bit. You know, the most recent good book about it is by Sean Bottomley, and he's careful, but basically comes down on the notion that it did encourage the development and diffusion of technology during the Industrial Revolution, but not, you know, particularly sort of strongly. And the question is by how much? And so one of the problems that we run into is that a lot of literature has shown that the majority of important inventions were never patented. For all kinds of reasons. In England, probably the most important one is that until 1851, a patent was very expensive. But it was also that the patent office was very inefficient and so on and so forth. And so, so here is one contemporary. This is the admittedly cantankerous Victorian Charles Babbage, of course, widely seen as one of the sort of ancestors of the computer, who talked about the patent system and called it a fraudulent lottery, which gives its blanks to genius and its prizes to knaves. This is written in 1830, long before the reform. And you know, so this is, and shall we say, somebody in the know who had a very negative view of the patent system. Others had more, you know, better views of it. But it's clear that the vast bulk of people who patented spent a lot of money. I mean, in England alone, it was £100, and if you wanted to have an entire kingdom, it was 3 times as much. So, I mean, this is a lot of money at the time, and for the vast bulk of people patented, the returns were negative. They spent the money, never made a penny out of the thing. But this is actually, in my view, an important point, because essentially you can think of a patent system as a lottery, right? You spend £100, and hopefully there's some probability that you will, you know, win the big prize. And a few people did. I mean, there's a few cases of, you know, well-documented cases in which people who took out patents made a lot of money. James Watt may be the most famous one. But it's not quite like a lottery, and that's important. In a lottery, basically, if you think about it rationally, the probability of winning, both objective and conditional on this being you, is essentially the same, right? I mean, you can't affect in any way or chance, you know, your probability of winning by being who you are. With a patent, that's not quite true. Everybody thinks, aha, my patent isn't like those guys' patent because it's mine, and I'm smarter than everybody else, and so I have a much better chance of winning than, you know, the unconditional probability of people before me. And this, again, I'm citing Adam Smith here. It is going to be very soon 250 years to the publication of The Wealth of Nations. So Adam Smith, this is in The Wealth of Nations. He says, the overweening conceit of which the greater part of men have of their own abilities, and the chance of gain is by every man more or less overvalued, and the chance of loss undervalued. So what does this mean? It means that the fraudulent lottery that Babbage was talking about is actually a positive factor, because it essentially reduced the inherent under-incentivization, because everybody thought they had a better chance of making money than they really had. So this is a bad deal for the inventors, and most of whom ended up very disappointed, but it was a good deal for society, because you get more inventive activity than you really wanted. And so in that unintended way, I think this institution actually connected the Industrial Enlightenment to the Industrial Revolution by putting up this institution. Incidentally, both France and the United States get patent system right after their revolutions occurred. The US in 1790, France in 1791. So if you think about the American and the French revolutions as essentially triumphs of the Enlightenment, which at least in the early stages they were, this is one of the first things that they do. This is something that the Industrial Enlightenment believed in. All right, so much for incentives. Now I want to talk a little bit about access and diffusion. So it's kind of obvious that if useful knowledge increases, so we make inventions and discoveries, and if they can't be harnessed and if they can't be deployed and accessed by people, then they're not going to have any economic effect. In fact, that is probably what happened with Greek science, I think, but that's a different story. But in order to access them, there's something called access cost. So access cost essentially is the knowledge may be there, but you have to spend money and time and effort and whatnot to access it. And so what really counts is how high are the access costs in society. So, you know, we can think of technology that affects the access cost. I mean, many of us have lived through the emergence of the internet, and we knew what it was like before and would know what it was after. Clearly, access costs have declined to essentially something that's very close to zero. Well, in the past, the printing press and writing, and you can think of various ways in which access costs are affected. Now, the reason why they're important is kind of obvious. First, you want to give industrialists and producers access to best practice science to basically use this sort of cutting-edge knowledge in your production process. Now, I should add, maybe in the 18th century, that wasn't all that great, and so one has to be careful about that. But even there, I can think of examples in which it mattered. But you also want to tell innovators on whose shoulders they should stand, right? So, as I said, in some cases, you did need scientific knowledge, and there is, in fact, a literature of inventors, people like James Watt and Josiah Wedgwood, writing to what they called at the time natural philosophers, which is essentially scientists, and asking for advice. Okay, particularly Watt, who was Scottish, was writing to his mentors at the University of Edinburgh. Another reason why you want to have access is because a lot of invention is not altogether new, but it consists of the hybridization and recombination of existing knowledge, as has been pointed out by economists many times. And that's, of course, true. But in order to do that, you have to know what's around. So access to knowledge in order to recombine it and borrow it from it and create new hybrids is critical. You want, of course, needless to say, avoid reinventing the wheel and avoid dead-end research. And finally, there's sort of the other direction in which a lot of people would do science looking at the kind of problems that the world has. So they need to get input from the real world if they're living in some kind of ivory tower. See, where do I need to solve, where does society need me to solve problems? So basically, access to existing knowledge of both kinds is quite critical. Now, how does this knowledge diffuse? So a lot of it is through interaction between people. If you want social capital, okay, people who would know things, whereas sort of as a distinction in the French literature between savants and fabricants. So the savants are people who know things, and the fabricants are people who make things. And the question is, do they actually talk to each other? And there's a famous article now written in 1942 by a sociologist who basically points out that that is one of the keys to economic progress, to have this communication between producers and people who know things. And that, I think, is a critical and integral part of what I call the Industrial enlightenment. So all over Europe, if you look at the 18th century, there's this proliferation of scientific societies and academies, all kind of local clubs and associations, informal meetings in salons and in coffee houses and in taverns and in parks, in which physicists and doctors and chemists do little experiments and lecture to people who are interested. And people who are interested are people who thought that they could use this in some ways. The most famous of these societies, of which many books have been written, is the Birmingham Lunar Society, that had such famous members as Matthew Boulton and James Watt and Erasmus Darwin, the grandfather of Charles, and on and on and on. But there were many others, lesser-known ones, in which similar activities went on. One of the more important ones are Masonic lodges. So the Freemasons are very much an Enlightenment kind of phenomenon, and in those lodges they actually had scientific lectures that were attended by the members. And so it's important to understand that this kind of networking happens among social elites. So I have been arguing for a long time that basically to understand the Industrial Revolution, you really need to look at the elite, or what I call the upper tail of the human capital. So for I would say 90% of the population, in all due respect, probably did not play much of a role in pushing the envelope out. Okay, you need to look at people whom we would call intellectuals, also that's a vague term, but people are intellectuals, educated people, local politicians and notables, but also people like engineers, instrument makers, clock makers, millwrights, surveyors, coal mine viewers. These are the sort of the creme de la creme of the artisanal class. And some of these would be intellectuals, some of these would be highly skilled, extremely clever with their hands. But basically, you're looking at the top of the best people. And these people, we can show this, are increasingly networked. They talk to each other. They communicate with each other. Knowledge spread. And so you look at some of those industrialists, and I just put them 3 names here, but I could make the list longer. So Wedgwood himself, the great potter, Robert Owen, who is, of course, a famous intellectual, William Strutt, the son of Jedediah Strutt. I mean, lots of these people basically write papers. They have actually an output. They are members of the Royal Society. They talk to intellectuals. They lecture at universities. I mean, they are part of an elite in which people who make things and people who know things are mingled. And here's a special case, which I think is quite important and kind of interesting because it's not quite what you expect. I call this the codification project. So here is something to think about. Technological knowledge, through most of history, until the 19th century, and even today to some extent, is tacit. And by tacit, I mean it's not written down or not codified. Instead, you basically learn it by going to somebody's lab and serving as a postdoc for 6 years, as it happens today, of course, in many of the sciences. But in those days, it was mostly through apprenticeship, right? So you were an apprentice, and you learned how to be a baker or a shoemaker or whatever. And basically, you would be taught how to do that, essentially by looking around and imitating and emulating and doing what the master did. And then, your parents paid for that, and after 6 years, you'd be done. And I've written about that. But of course, it's much better if you could learn from books. And so what's happening in the Industrial Enlightenment is these books slowly start appearing. People start codifying technology. And codified knowledge, it probably still needs some personal contact as well, or else we'd all be out of business, so to speak. But the codified knowledge itself is more accessible and diffuses faster because you basically can go to the local library and read it. And so that codification project, which so hasn't really been seen as making a major contribution by much of the literature, but you can sort of see how it's developing. We see the founding of libraries. We see how books are being written such that it's easy to look up things like book indexes and very detailed tables of contents, encyclopedia, things like that. So I'll give you 2 examples of that, and I will not mention the one that everybody else is mentioning, which is the Grande Encyclopédie, edited by d'Alembert and Diderot, which has, thousands and thousands of technical illustrations of technology. But to point out that there's much more than just the Grand Encyclopédie, which economic historians have used with great success. So this is less known than the D'Alembert and Diderot Encyclopedia. And this is called the Description des Arts et Métiers. It's published in France. The project took 100 years to be fully, to come out. It was first proposed by Colbert in the 1670s, and the first volumes are coming out. You see it here in 1761. So, I mean, close to 100 years. So this was not something that's done on an impulse. Things in France can move slowly. But this is a major organization of what we would call useful knowledge. So here's one example I picked basically at random, okay? So this is a picture from the Description des Arts et Métiers. You will not recognize this unless you spent, like I did, many extremely boring hours on this thing. This is the art of locksmith. So this is a particular skill, and these are all the tools that these locksmiths are using. And you know, if you wanted to study how locksmiths worked, and you'd probably still, you wouldn't be a fully skilled locksmith just by reading this volume, which is, I think, 250 pages, if I recall. But you would be a hell of a lot better prepared for studying it than if you didn't. And if you use it side by side, it would be much better. Here are two other forms of the codification process. The one on the left is written by a French doctor, because he's a medicine. But this is about coal. And this is published in 1770, and it's a very good description of coal mining, much of which he studied in England, because England had more coal mines than France. On the right, you see, and this is an early book on machines. Okay, this is written by a man called Agustin de Betancourt, who, despite his name, was actually of Spanish origin. But this is a first or an early treatment of how machines work. And it's very detailed and very technical. And so it would teach you something about machines that is quite clear. And so we have, I think, sensed for a while that these books were important. There is a, by now, classic paper by Maris Cucciarini and Nico Voigtlander that actually shows that the Grand Encyclopédie, which they had data on who bought it, is correlated with the growth of modern industry in France. So this is interesting because these books are all written in France, where the Industrial Revolution basically was a little later than in England. And the odd thing is, as it's been pointed out, that it was actually the French and later on the Germans who did codification far better than England. Now, of course, Britain has something, so they have, for instance, this book. This is a 3-volume book, and you can sort of see that this is also published in the middle of the Industrial Revolution. This is 1764. And you can see basically this is kind of a mini encyclopedia, not quite as extensive as D'Alembert and Diderot, but still a very advanced thing. And you can see all the things that they're teaching, which many of which are useful: pharmacy, anatomy, surgery, if you want, but also things like hydraulics, mechanics, pneumatics, and so on and so forth. And I mean, you look at these articles, they're pretty advanced. You know, there's formulas in there, there's very detailed descriptions. And the same is true in medicine. Here's this medical dictionary, published also in England by a guy called Robert James. This is published in the 1740s. It was immediately translated into French. It was still used in the late 19th century. Mark Twain sort of made fun of it because obviously the medicine is completely obsolete by that time. But this is a codification of knowledge that is really a project that this people undertakes, instinctively feeling that this is a way to make society okay. Now, just to come back for a second to patents, you can sort of see why patents were important, because not only they incentivized, they also diffused knowledge, because anybody could basically walk into the patent offices and read the full description of a patent and say, aha, that's how you do it. Now, I can't use it now because it's under patent protection, but in N years the patent will expire and I'm on it. And in fact, you didn't have to walk into the patent office because many of these patents were reprinted verbatim in various mechanics magazines. So people had access to it, and it worked actually quite well. All right, so this is basically the story I want to tell. And then, of course, the question that any good economic historian will ask is evidence. Is there any evidence to support it. And so if I went through the evidence, we'd be here until way too late. So I'm just going to give you a little bit of a flavor of it, and then I will be glad to send you to the literature. But there are a bunch of studies carried out in the last 10 years, presumably inspired by the thinking about the connection between the Enlightenment and the Industrial Revolution, which have tried to measure this and test hypotheses, as economists are apt to do. And basically what you need is something that you're explaining. So measures of technological progress are notoriously hard to come by. And so economic historians have used two variables on which there are data. One of them is patents, so the number of patents. And so, as I said, it's questionable because not all inventions were patented, and there are all kinds of issues, but it's for something we have. And so people have used it. The other thing, which I think is quite clever, but also problematic, are the number of people participating in these industrial exhibitions. So one of the things that the Industrial Enlightenment thinks of is, in order to diffuse knowledge, we should have exhibitions. And so from 1800 on, we see these exhibitions happening. France is, the first ones are happening under Napoleon. Britain has a few, and then you get the Great Exhibition, which is the mother of all industrial exhibitions, which is the 1851 Crystal Palace exhibition that a lot of people have used. And so people have used these proxies and then tried to relate them to the kind of institutions that I was talking about. So this is a dissertation yet unpublished quite a while, 8 years ago now, by somebody at the LSE called James Dowie. And basically what James does is he defines these institutions that he calls knowledge access institutions. And basically these are things like I talked about, so learned societies, Masonic lodges, public libraries. And what he tries to do is to show that they correlate with these output variables for patents and exhibitions. And he shows quite convincingly that by and large it works. So, I have some regression results here. I'm not going to go through it because we have too much time. But basically, you'll have to trust me when I say that the results are statistically significant and economically significant. That is to say, not just that they are, that they meet the sort of standard statistical test, but that the magnitudes are such that, yes, these things did have an impact. It's not the only thing that mattered, and I would have never argued that it was, but it was important, okay? So there's far more here going on. Here's another paper. This is more recently. This is by a Spanish scholar, Galofré Villa, basically following the methodology that Dowie outlined and come up with very, very similar results. And he, too, is looking for these bridges between people who knew things and those who made things. There are similar papers written for Germany, coming out with similar conclusions, and now for France. And so it seems that there's something there, and that at least as a first approximation, it meets that standard test that the economic historians demand, which is, do the data confirm your hypothesis? And I mean, it's a bit of a relief for me to see this. So let me conclude, and then we can go on. Okay, so the Great Divergence, as Joachim pointed out, is a recent phenomenon driven by the Industrial Revolution. But as I would argue, is the Industrial Revolution itself goes back to Enlightenment. And through the Enlightenment, and this is something I haven't really talked about, but I'm glad to answer questions, to medieval times. And there's a different book that's now in press almost, I would say, by myself, Avner Greif, and Guido Tabellini, which I'll talk about tomorrow in the workshop, that deals with that. But my point is that basically to understand the Industrial Revolution and its cultural roots, we need to deal with the Enlightenment as a major phenomenon that is uniquely European. And so Prince Rasselas' philosopher was right. Knowledge mattered, but we need to know why this knowledge arose in Europe and not anywhere else, and why the Europeans were able to use that knowledge so much better than anybody else. And so we need to look not just at the culture, but at the institutions that emerge, things like the patent system, and how they affect the culture, and the culture affects them. So there's this co-evolution of cultural fact, which is what people believe and what they value, and institutional fact, which is what are the organizational framework in which people operate. And so, maybe I should say this. The soil in which the seeds of the Industrial Revolution were planted was particularly fertile in Britain. And Britain does produce, in many ways, an environment that's highly conducive to innovation, and we could talk about that. But having a fertile soil does not guarantee a good crop by itself. You need seeds to put in the soil. And what I'm talking about is, where do these seeds come from? And I immediately admit, you give me seeds and you put them in a desert soil with no water, nothing will happen, okay? But you need the seeds and you need the soil. And you need to talk about both if you want to understand the European miracle. Thank you.
All right, have a seat. All right, thank you so much for a brilliant lecture, Joel. We're going to open it up to questions on Menti. We've received a few, and while we're waiting for people to jump in, let me abuse the chair's privilege and ask you a question of my own. You highlighted the importance of belief in progress.
Yes.
And one of the things that's quite striking, if you follow media, social media, and so forth these days, is a growing wave of people questioning whether progress hasn't really run out of steam, whether we've had too much of it. You can take a master now at the University of Barcelona in degrowth, and there's an enormous amount of skepticism whether progress hasn't gone too far, maybe as a result of the climate crisis, as some people like to call it. So if you're a historian, you often get asked about the future, and it's a tricky business, but I wondered whether you had any thoughts on that.
So I'm aware of that, of course. There's people like that running around, not just in Europe, but I'm afraid in the United States as well. In fact, a few of them have been observed in my university also. I've tried to avoid them. It really tells me one thing, and that's why the world needs people like you and me to tell them that this is bunk. Because, clearly the notion that we can do away with growth and completely, stop it because we are already living so well, completely loses sight with the enormous challenges that our age is facing. And it's not just the challenge of climate change, although that's a major one, but there are many other climate challenges that we need to meet and that will require resources. And resources are created by growth. And so the people who are against growth don't tell you how they're going to meet those challenges, because the only way to meet them is through growth. The question is not, should we have more or less growth? The question is, what kind of growth should we have? And I think if you push these people to the wall, they'll probably admit there's certain kinds of growth that we need. We need the kind of growth and technological change that allow us to wean ourselves from fossil fuel. That's growth. You need to completely rejig the infrastructure of energy transmission, of water transmission, of sewage disposal, you name it. I mean, much of the United States is an infrastructure that is 120 years old and that needs to be replaced, all the way down to lead pipes that are poisoning children. How do we replace these? Well, it's too expensive. Well, if you say something too expensive, that means you need growth, because growth creates resources by which things that are too expensive can be achieved. And so I sympathize with people who feel some disappointment with modern economic growth, because I think their expectations were set too high. And it's not the answer to every question in human history. It's not even clear also, I think the evidence is moving that direction, that growth actually makes people happier. And that growth creates maybe a better society to live in. But it's also clear to me that people who come out of my course at Northwestern, and this is the first thing I teach them the good old days may have been old, but they weren't good. And I talk about things like infant mortality, up to 250 per thousand in the first year, and child mortality another 250 until the 10th year. And I say, how many people here really would feel that having to bury half the children that you born is something that you don't want to get rid of? Or how many people here would want to live in Florida in July without air conditioning? And on and on and on, you know. And so people then say, oh yeah, well, you know, maybe you're right, Professor, my students say. We hadn't thought about that, but growth is bad, isn't it? And then, of course, the next twin of growth is bad is capitalism is bad, which I avoid altogether.
Very good. Thank you, Joel. The top voted question on Menti is, what role would you attribute to religion, or in the European case, the decline of religion, to the great reversal of knowledge?
That's a wonderful question. So, as I said, religion plays sort of an ambiguous role. And I actually have, even though I'm not particularly a good Jew, I have actually written in cases in which I defended the role of religion in economic growth, not just through the Merton thesis, which I mentioned, but even if you look at medieval science and technology, it's almost entirely carried out by men of the cloth, that is to say, either monks or priests, because they were the intellectuals of the time. And so any medieval writer that you find serious about science and technology, they tend to be churchmen. And it's not quite clear that religion always plays a negative role. What is true is that the Enlightenment is a movement of secularization. Not every great thinker of the Enlightenment was an atheist. I mentioned Newton already, but you look at somebody like Joseph Priestley, who actually was, you know, a vicar. And so they are reconcilable, but roughly speaking, there is, I think, a separation of the two. And there's a famous, probably apocryphal story of the great French physicist Laplace, Pierre-Simon Laplace, the greatest physicist of his age, who wrote this, you know, this book that summarizes a full mathematization of the Newtonian world. And he gave a copy to the Emperor Napoleon. This is 1806 or 1807. And according to the story, Napoleon, whether he read it or not, I don't know. I don't think his math was good enough. But Napoleon then invited him to the palace and said, Monsieur Laplace, what place is there for God in your system? And Laplace, according to the story, answered, I have had no use for that hypothesis, sire. And I think that is basically what is happening. That is to say, Europe doesn't abandon religion, but it separates physics from metaphysics. And by and large now, science is done by people who may be atheists or who may be believers, but very few of them basically go back and say, well, we should take our inspiration, you know, from the Bible or things like that. Now, there are such people in the United States who still, you know, creationists and okay, but those are essentially not scientists. I mean, they do not deserve the term scientist. They are people who believe in religion. And so I would say that for the last 150 years, probably religion has been much less of a stimulant to science as it used to be, and in many places it got in the way. In particular, I think you see this fierce resistance to the theory of evolution that the origins of the species created, in which you had these famous debates that, you know, believe it or not, are still going on. And in that regard, I would think that, certainly if you look at the last 200 years, the role of religion is probably negative, but I would say the size of the derivative is small.
Okay, thank you for that one. So another high-rated question is, there's savants and fabricants today in the social media space. Okay. Do you expect this to have similarly productive and beneficial effects? Yeah,
I'm not sure what the social media, I mean, if you think of social media as things like Twitter, I'm kind of skeptical about it. But it's quite clear that today we are in a situation in which if you are an inventor working in any particular area, all the way from, you know, molecular genetics to material science, and you want to know what the best science is, you know, you basically click a few keys on your keyboard and it's right in front of you. And so that part of the access cost is basically gone to zero. Now, actually, reading and understanding these papers may be a different matter. You may need to get a consultant or somebody helps you explain what's in it. But how do you find a consultant? Again, you go on the internet and you try to figure out who's good, and then you send a few emails to friends and you say, have you heard sort of so-and-so? I need a consultant in this particular problem, in organic chemistry. And you find out. And so in that sense, I think that connection between savant and fabricant has become much easier to materialize, and that is one of the great sources of the rapid progress in hundreds of fields that we're still experiencing, because it is no longer hard to find out who is doing what. Here is the real problem, and that is with the proliferation of information, the big task is to separate between the good stuff and the bad stuff, the wheat and the chaff, because there is a great deal of fake knowledge floating around, masquerading as science, and actually telling the real stuff from the fake stuff can be hard. And if you lived through COVID, you've seen it. Okay, there's a lot of sort of pseudo-scientific stuff about COVID that people with degrees and with affiliations to Stanford, you think of this guy Scott Atlas and other people. Basically, these are charlatans, but they have credentials of scientists. And for somebody who's not quite into this, separating the two is a tough assignment. And so that worries me, because that's part of what I call access cost. It's not just finding the information, but actually recognizing it as genuine and serious.
Very good. Do you have any thoughts on AI and whether this is going to supercharge the progress of knowledge?
So I'm a great AI fan, even so, like everybody else, I worry about it. I don't think it is going to destroy the world or wipe out humanity or make us all the slaves of evil robots. I mean, these are all things. For me, what really is critical in AI, and I want to make this point because this is a really critical point, is that AI is a tool. And if you look at the history of science and what derives major breakthroughs, it's not that we get smarter, it's we have better tools. Galileo was very smart, okay, but a lot of people who were smart before him, but they did not have his telescope. With the telescope, he could see things that human eye could not see. A few years later, people invent microscopes, people invent vacuum pumps. There's a whole set of tools that comes online that drives the scientific revolution. The same is true in the 19th century. Guys like Pasteur and Koch and the germ revolution, which is one of the great strides forward of mankind has ever experienced, they had better laboratory tools, better microscopes that allowed them to do things. And we can make these examples over and over and over, So spectroscopy helped isolate, understand the DNA. I mean, better tools drive science. AI is an absolutely unbelievably powerful tool, in the sense that it can, see connections between huge data sets. It can do machine learning in the sense that it can actually train itself to come after connections that you couldn't find by any kind of statistical analysis. I think this is a tool that really boggles the mind. And it's not what AI will do, it's that people will do using AI. And I think that is quite significant, because my own view is that the great challenge that we're facing, in fact, is climate change. And there was an article in The Economist published about a year ago pointing out how AI can be utilized in finding solutions to the consequences of global warming. And that should be our great hope, because a political solution I don't see on the horizon. Yeah, sorry.
All right, Ernst.
So in some of your earlier work, you emphasized the role of the moral infrastructure of social norms for the origins of progress and economic progress. Mm-hmm. Now today you emphasize the role of the belief in progress and access costs and accumulation of knowledge. But in the end, that accumulation of knowledge doesn't help much if it can't be implemented in a productive way in society. And that brings me to one of the claims you had in your earlier work that it was very important to have a cultural infrastructure that, for example, punishes cheaters in order to get economic growth going. Because if you have, let's say, if you have corrupt patent officers, if you have corrupt judges, if you have corruption everywhere, you can't get economic growth going. And so I would like to know from you to what extent, how do these two worlds relate?
So here, I'll tell you, Douglas North once said to me the following, which I always keep on citing. He says, Joel, he says, there's a good reason why in economic history we talk about technological progress, but institutional change. He says, in knowledge, in technology, there is progress because it's cumulative. Institutions, and by which he meant exactly the kind of things that you're talking about, norms and rules and customs and things and values, things like that. He says, there is no evidence in history that these things are getting, in the very long run, better over time. And I think that is the great dilemma of our age, because wherever you look today, certainly in the last 10, 15 years, there seems to be an evidence of institutional deterioration, just as there was evidence of institutional deterioration in the interwar period, and then an improvement after 1945 and again after 1990, but it sort of goes up and down. So the notion of progress that I talked about today pertains exclusively to useful knowledge. Now, the people in the Enlightenment were thinking that we can perfect human nature, we can perfect human institutions, and all this sort of anti-Enlightenment or counter-Enlightenment literature, starting all the way from Adorno and Horkheimer's famous dialectic of the Enlightenment, all the way down to people like John Gray and other sort of cantankerous Englishmen, basically saying, look, all this progress, there's no progress, things are getting worse. And there's some grain of truth to that, because you can sort of see how, in terms of organizing our society and our polity, it's very hard to convince yourself that we are doing a hell of a lot better than, say, the early medieval communes, or for that matter, Athenian democratic states in the 5th century BC. And so there are good questions about how we can live in a world in which technology becomes more and more sophisticated, but our human institutions turn out to be very hard to improve. And that, I think, is an enormous concern, because what happens if our institutions stay bad, but we give people more and more powerful tools? And that's, I think, where the dystopian stories start sounding a lot more true. I'm not worried about growth itself being harmful. I'm worried about the gap between the way human societies function and how people treat one another, and how much capability there is between people with different opinions still to cooperate. And what I'm seeing around the world in the last 10 or 15 years, maybe I'm just getting old and I'm getting gloomy, but what I'm seeing is the capability of people of different opinions working together to achieve a common goal is constantly under threat. And I mean, the United States, this has clearly become very remarkable. We no longer oppose each other, we hate each other. And that is scary like hell, Ernst, because it's not just there. It's in many countries you see the same thing happening. And and the Enlightenment was exactly about that. If you read the writings of the founders of the United States, okay, so they understand this, and they try to write down rules that make people work together. And roughly speaking, with a few exceptions, this has actually worked reasonably well. But there too, you can see it going up and it's going down. In 1861, it went down very sharply. So this is a major concern. And the same, now what is become interesting, and just to one more remark. Marx used to believe that there was this irreconcilable gap between different groups in society separated by economics. And today it's quite clear that that has slowly vanished. But instead of making society better, it's made society worse, because it's been replaced by a tribalism that nobody really expected to emerge. When I was an undergraduate student in the late 60s, that story would have sounded insane. I mean, we grew out of that, I say. There's still maybe working class capitalism, and so on. But this notion of tribalism, of, hatred between people who, that's... And I'm looking at the war and I see, I blew it. I was too optimistic about humans. And I think that is, in fact, was the mistake of many of the people, the optimistic people, like Condorcet especially, in writing in the Enlightenment, in which they basically thought that human nature was perfectible. And it may not be. And if it isn't, giving them all this technological power may be problematic. And that's, I think, where these dystopian people may have a point. And I lose sleep over that, Ernst, at night. I do.
Okay, well, on that note, let me thank you, Joel, for an inspiring and thought-provoking lecture. And thank you all for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed the presentation and the discussion. And I hope I'll see you at one of our events very soon. We will have a webcast on September 25th with Lorenzo Casabori, a colleague from the Department of Economics, who is going to tell us about research on agriculture in sub-Saharan Africa. And on October 31st, we invite you to the Forum for Economic Dialogue, where we will explore questions around artificial intelligence and its impact on the economy with our keynote speaker, Sandal Muller-Nathan. Please also remember we have a YouTube channel in case you're bored any one of these evenings or soccer doesn't do it for you. And with that, we wish you a pleasant evening and a safe journey home.